Hey, good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, as it were, to my friend Rod Dreher, who is joining us. I think it's 10 p.m. in Budapest where you are. Is that right,
That's
Rod?
right. That's right.
Okay, well, I am really thrilled to have you here and thrilled to introduce you to those joining who are not familiar yet with your work. Given that I think you're going to be new to a lot of free press, a lot of free pressers, notwithstanding the fact that you've written two incredibly important essays for us today and then a few months ago, I thought maybe we would sort of introduce you to the audience because there's a lot of people who say a lot of pretty hysterical, hyperbolic things about the threat from the right. You are different from many of those people. You are not an MSNBC Rachel Maddow watching Chardonnay wine mom. Far from it. In fact, Rod, I was introduced to your work in September of 2020. I think I'm getting that date right. When I read a book that I don't think it's overstating it for me to say had a profound impact on my life. The book is called Live Not by Lies, a manual for Christian dissidents. Now, again, you might think that that is strange, dear audience, knowing that I am not Christian, but the book had a profound impact on me. So, Rod, maybe give us a few sentences about who you are without being too much without putting you on the spot too much, telling
Okay.
us about your conservative bona fides, and then maybe telling us a little bit about this book, because I think it's a really important context for the conversation we want to have today.
Sure. Well, I've been a conservative journalist for over 30 years. I've worked places like the Washington Times, the New York Post, National Review. And the stuff I write about is mostly about the intersection between religion, culture, and politics. I'm not strictly a political journalist. I'm also a practicing Christian, an Eastern Orthodox Christian. And what brings me to you today, what brought me to the book Live Not by Lies, was about 10 years ago. I began hearing when I was living in the US from people who had come to America to escape Soviet totalitarianism. They were seeing the rise of the Great Awakening and starting to say that the things they were seeing with the Great Awakening reminded them of what they had left behind in the Soviet bloc. That sounded kind of hysterical to me because, like, where are the gulags? Where are the secret police? But the more I talked to them, the more I realized they were seeing something and feeling something that the rest of us could not, which is to say, even though we don't have the classic markers, the Orwellian totalitarianism, nevertheless, within identity politics and wokeness, there is a strong totalitarian theme and sensibility. So I wrote this book called Live Not by Lies, the title itself comes from the last message that Alexander Solzhenitsyn sent to his followers in Russia before the Soviets exiled him in 1974. And I wrote it as a Christian for a Christian audience, but the things I said in the book about the way totalitarianism is manifesting today in the free liberal democracies of the West, it really struck a chord with you and with other non-Christians. The book got zero mainstream media publicity, even though I'd already written two New York Times bestsellers, because, and I can see why, because it went against everything the mainstream media believes is true and good and noble. Nevertheless, by word of mouth, the book sold over 210,000 copies in the US. It's in 10 languages now. And they made a documentary film, Angel.com, Angel Studios. You can watch it, you can stream it on Angel.com. I just feel that we don't take seriously enough the totalitarian aspects of wokeness. But what brings me to you today is I'm seeing very similar things arise with my own tribe on the right. I'm pro-Trump. I'm an old friend of J.D. Vance. But that doesn't mean that we should give a pass to the wokesters on our own side, on the right.
Okay, so you are someone who, suffice it to say, has spent the better part of the past decade exposing what you call, and I think this is accurate, the soft totalitarianism or the illiberal leftism that's come to swallow much of the cultural and political left. And the context and the way that your piece today, which is an incredible piece, it's called, for those who haven't read it, The Woke Right is Coming for Your Sons. It opens when you're on tour with this new incredible documentary, Live Not by Lies. You just told people how to find it. We'll put that in the chat as well. Someone asks you, at one of the screenings, do you think wokeness has peaked? Do you think wokeness is over? This is a question I get a lot now that President Trump is in power. And Rod, tell us what you said to this person.
Well, I told her that in some ways, wokeness from the left seems to have peaked. I mean, we still have a long way to go because it's so deeply embedded in institutions. But the conditions that Hannah Arendt, the great political theorist, the conditions that she identified in her 1951 classic, The Origins of Totalitarianism, the conditions that give rise to totalitarianism are still very much with us. And because of that, we're now starting to see on the right, among the very online young men in particular, a sort of right-wing version of identity politics that can easily tip over into totalitarianism. But a lot of us on the right don't see it because we're so busy looking at the left-wing version that we're missing what's happening right under our noses.
Here's the broad dynamic, the way that I see things playing out. The woke movement basically came along and said everything is taboo. Right? The whole notion of biology, to choose like the most basic example, the idea that you weren't allowed to say that there was violent rioting in the summer of 2020, the idea, and we could go on and on and on throughout the list. What the far right, the new right, what you're calling the woke right, and we'll talk about the language because some people have issue with it, what they have come along and said is, screw you. This movement said that everything is taboo. We are now going to come along and say nothing is taboo. Nothing is forbidden. Is that the dynamic as you see it playing out, Rod?
Yeah, that's basically it. And one thing I talked about in the essay, and I think this is important, is why some of these young men, young white men, that's who it usually is, but they're not exclusively white. I mean, Candace Owens, Kanye West, but these young white guys have grown up in a culture. They're very online, but they've grown up in a culture that tells them that they, as white males, are what's wrong with the world. And they've suffered not just hurt feelings from it, they've been denied jobs, they've been denied access to education, and on and on and on. And so they're very, very alienated. You get some of these bad actors, anti-Semites, racists, white nationalists, who come along and say, there's nothing wrong with you, join us. And you get a sense of solidarity, you get a sense of self-defense, and you get a sense of purpose. The cost, though, is your soul and your mind.
Well, it turned out that telling young people that their race and their ethnicity and their gender was the most important thing about them. And that those qualities, this is what wokeness basically said, gave them either a kind of social and cultural and political original sin or original privilege. We are now sort of reaping the backlash of it. That's the premise of the piece. I think a very powerful way in, Rod, if you wouldn't mind, is the second part of the essay after the introduction. You talk about a few stories that I think really brings this issue that can be abstract for a lot of people that are not hyper online, that brings it alive to people. And I wondered if you would tell us one or two of them, perhaps starting with the story of what happened in your son's own school.
Right. Well, my kids are all adults now, but they went to a classical Christian school, a very small school in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. At one point, my older son told his mother and me that one of the teachers there was red-pilling the guys in his history class into white nationalism. We just didn't believe him because we thought, how is this even possible? This guy, his name is Thomas Acord, very mild-mannered, quiet, studious young man. He seemed perfectly normal. And how can this exist in our nice little Christian school? The guy goes on to become headmaster. And back in 2022, I think it was, Alistair Roberts and Susanna Black Roberts exposed him as being a virulent anti-Semite racist online under a pseudonym. We helped identify him as, oh my God, this is the guy, this is our headmaster. And when he got exposed, he denied it. And then when he couldn't deny it anymore, he said, okay, it was me, but I was in a fugue state. Well, he lost his job. What I find so interesting about that, though, is that none of his colleagues, the teachers, none of the parents, nobody could have imagined this was happening in our school. And I think this is a really important dynamic, Bari, because so many of us who are older and who are not heavily online, we tend to think of this sort of thing as it just doesn't happen to nice people like us, like our sons, people who are neo-Nazi types. They're like white trash, but it's not true. This is happening to good middle-class kids who have become radicalized online. Similarly, when I was in the U.S. for the tour for Live Not by Lies, I met several college professors, people around my age, I'm 58, who teach in Christian universities, who are saying, oh my God, you would not believe how strong anti-Semitism is among the boys in our classes. They don't know where it's coming from. Well, they say online, but that's as far as it goes, because people like us don't follow the Nick Fuentes and the sources of all this. But it's coming at us very fast, and it's very dangerous. And, I think about what I would have liked liberals, decent liberals, to have done 15, 20 years ago when this stuff started coming out on the left, this identity politics. If they had taken a stand and said, you know what, this is wrong, this is illiberal, this identity politics, we're not going to stand for it, they might have shut it down, and we might not be in this bad place today. But here we are. And I feel like that we on the right, who are not like, David French, liberal Republican types, but who do support the president and what he's doing, we have a responsibility to stand up and say, we will not let this happen to us, not let this happen to our kids.
Do you feel like that standing up is happening broadly on the right now?
Not really. I mean, it's happening in some places, but it's not happening mostly, I think, because we on the right are so filled with anger, justified anger, at what wokeness has done throughout the institutions and the media and the culture, that we sort of have this tacit feeling that we have no enemies to the right. Let's not stop and attack our own now while there's so many battles left to fight. But this is exactly how the decent left allowed these crazies to take over their politics and their movement.
If the woke left was not entirely, but largely typified by women, like women were sort of at and are the enforcers and the leader of this movement, explain why the woke right movement is so appealing to men. In the headline of your piece, you talk about boys, not girls.
Yeah. Because it unapologetically attacks the over-feminized culture we live in, this therapeutic culture, which demonizes masculinity, masculine traits. It tells these young men, it's okay to be masculine, it's okay to be manly. And the sort of HR types, human resources types, and the teachers who chastise you for every normal thing you feel, you got to push back hard against them. And that ends up going into an Andrew Tate place, a place that's deeply misogynistic, and it goes towards anti-Semitism, because some of these people identify key liberal figures as Jewish, but it's evil, and it doesn't matter that it's coming from quote unquote our side. Evil is evil is evil, and it's going to corrupt our kids. I've talked to fathers, right? Friends of mine whose sons are caught up in this, and they're desperate. They said, we didn't raise him that way, but he got to be that way because of what he heard in school, being told constantly that he's no good. And he found people online who didn't care, who were happy to be transgressive, because it was so much fun to push your way to spaces where you were told you couldn't be, you didn't belong because of who you are. Now, I'll remind you that Hannah Arendt said that is one of the key things that led to totalitarianism in Germany and in Russia. The fact that people who are responsible and who should have known better than to tolerate this stuff, they sat back and let it happen because it was so much fun to watch people who had been unfairly shut out push their way in. And they ended up destroying, in Hannah Arendt's words, the pillars of civilization just for the fun of being transgressive.
Okay, one of the things that some of the people who have criticized you and anyone else that dares talk about what's going on the right is, hold on, Rod. Okay, there's a few bad apples, but it's mostly an online phenomenon. And if we're trying to compare, look at what the woke left has conquered. They control, I'm parroting the argument,
Sure.
or karaokeing the argument, they control, the universities, mainstream media companies, Hollywood studios, HR departments of major corporations. And and now you're complaining about Candace Owens and a new Kanye West song? It's apples and oranges. What do you say to that critique?
Well, what I say to that is, imagine saying something like that. Oh, it's just online, it's just fringe, to a parent whose daughter was being taken in by the trans cult around 2013, 2014. We see where that has led. We can't let that happen to our own kids. Secondly, yeah, it really is true that the woke do have all this institutional power. But if you say that power is the factor that determines whether or not we should speak out against it, you're just buying into identity politics in a different way. And if these people should gain, these so-called woke right people should gain institutional power in media, in politics, and wherever, as the woke left has done, it'll be too big to stop. I support somebody like Chris Rufo, there's probably no more effective activist against wokeness on the right. But Chris Rufo doesn't go at it from a woke right perspective. He goes at it in defense of classical liberal values of race neutrality, of judging people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin or their sex or anything like that.
Okay, speaking of Chris Rufo, that's a perfect tee up, because he put an interesting and I think respectful good faith criticism on Twitter that I want to read. And while I do that, I want to invite all of you, thanks to those who have already sent in your excellent questions, put any of your questions in the chat. There's no dumb question. We really want to hear from you. So here's what Chris Rufo just put on Twitter a few moments ago. With respect to Rod and an acknowledgement that the discourse has indeed gone a bit haywire, to describe what's happening, he writes, as right-wing totalitarianism is overblown. Online shitposters are not the new Hitler, and the QAnon shaman is not going to seize the Oval Office. One can identify the problem while measuring and situating it accurately, he writes. And likewise, he says, it confuses rather than clarifies to say that wokeness has migrated to the right. Yes, we should point out the problem with right-wing antisemitism, but to label it woke right is inaccurate. It creates a false equivalency and fails to make necessary distinctions between the two ideologies, and in practice makes solving the problem of woke more difficult at the precise moment conservatives have the opportunity to make progress. Another small point, one should keep in mind, I'm almost done, that the right holds relatively little institutional power. This is that argument. And among the institutions under its sway has demonstrated a much stronger ability to police itself and maintain standards than the left. The question is how we think about arguments and trends and ideologies within the digital space. And then he goes on. What do you make? You've answered the institutional point. What do you make of the idea that saying it is wokeness, calling it wokeness, saying that wokeness has migrated to the right, confuses rather than clarifies? Why do you like using that language?
Well, because the moral argument and the political argument that the so-called woke right activists use is the same thing. It's a form of identity politics, just coded in right-wing language and right-wing concepts, and it's still wrong. I completely agree that the woke right in terms of power can't even begin to match the woke left. But that's why it's important to speak out about it now, police our own side right now, to keep it from getting out of hand. And I'll tell you that we had to take this out of the piece for length, but there was a young man who in my kid's school who was red pilled by this teacher, this white nationalist teacher, who had bragged under his pseudonym online that he was using his rising position within classical Christian schools to teach white nationalism to young men. One of his students went on to stick with this stuff in college. My son, who was his classmate, followed him online and tried to rescue him from this, but failed. This kid went on, the white nationalist, the closet white nationalist, to get a very high position in the Louisiana Republican Party shortly after graduation. Now, he's no longer there. He got involved in a horrible crime, and for all I know, he's in prison now. But the point is this: I guarantee you that nobody who hired him to be the political director of the Louisiana GOP had any idea what he was really up to, what he had been up to online. They just can't imagine it. If this guy had continued in his position, who knows what sort of evil thoughts he would have brought in to the institution. If you reach out now and stop this now and say, we have to keep fighting the woke left, but we can't succumb to their insane, evil way of thinking, then we can save the right. But, it's such a hard thing to talk about, Barry, because I don't in any way want to say, oh, well, you got woke left, you got woke right. Chris Rufo is making absolutely a fair point. But what he's missing is that the woke left started out as very tiny, as something confined just to college campuses and maybe the weird areas of online. But it expanded very, very quickly. And right now, in this sort of liquid environment we have, where there are no authorities left who can stop this sort of thing, we can't just sit back and wait for it to go away. We've got to jump on it right now. Last point, this is affecting real people. As I mentioned earlier, I know people whose families are affected by this, and it's tearing the hearts out of moms and dads and brothers and sisters and friends who are seeing the young men they love suddenly becoming monsters, and they don't know how to deal with it. And there's nobody out there on the right, people they trust, religious leaders, political leaders, authority figures, they can turn to for help, because we have this unstated and sometimes stated sense on the right of, hey, let's not notice this. No enemies to the right. We don't want to do anything to take away from our fighting the left, which holds most or all of the institutional power right now.
Okay, we have some really great questions. Thank you guys for sending them in. Please don't hesitate to send in more. I'm going to go to a few of them now. Barbara asked this, Rod. Wokeness on the left hit a wall when it transgressed past basic common sense. Why wouldn't wokeness on the right do the same?
Well, wokeness on the left transgressed against basic common sense many years ago. And yet the woke were in so many positions of authority within opinion forming institutions like universities, like media and elsewhere, to where it got to the point where you couldn't stop it. I mean, look at Joe Biden. I don't know who was actually running Joe Biden's White House, but the activists were in control, and they took these insane positions, biological males should be able to participate in women's sports, and it became policy. And I think that we can't sit back and let this sort of thing reach that level on the right in some future conservative administration, because first, it will take us down too. I think a lot of common sense people on the left, or at least centrists, voted Trump because they were so sick and tired of wokeness. I talked to two Hollywood people who are really accomplished artists who told me that if they had been back in the US at the time of the election, they would have voted Trump, not because they're conservatives, they're liberals, but because they could see how wokeness was destroying their ability to make art in Hollywood. I don't want the same thing to happen to my side. And now is the time to speak up and crush this thing, strangle this thing in the cradle.
Rod, as you mentioned earlier in the conversation, as you've written about, you're quite close to J.D. Vance. You were a supporter of Trump. Is there any evidence, and captures a few questions, that this problem, A, that the Trump administration is aware of it, and B, that it's infiltrated the Trump administration?
I honestly can't answer that, because after JD became vice president, he became impossible to reach for completely understandable reasons. I don't think JD would stand for this for 1 second. And frankly, I don't think Trump would either, although he has shown real carelessness in the past. Remember at Mar-a-Lago, he met with Milo and Kanye West and Nick Fuentes. I think Trump is so old, he just doesn't really understand what he's dealing with in cases like this. Trump's daughter, Ivanka, is Jewish. She's married to a Jewish husband. Trump has Jewish grandchildren. And Trump is from New York. I don't think he would go for this. I think the danger is that he could be so caught up in MAGA world that he would not see the particularities there. I don't know for a fact that's what's happened, but I can easily see it happening. I think we have less to worry about with JD because he is so much younger. He knows how online works. And I just don't think he would go there at all.
Okay, someone named Wayne asked the following. Rod, I'd love for you to define woke right. I'm very much against the anti-Semitic right, such as Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, he says. If these are the ones you're talking about, what makes them woke?
Well, without commenting on Tucker, who's a friend, and I don't watch his stuff, so I can't say one way or the other how far he goes. Nevertheless, the term woke right makes me uncomfortable for reasons we've discussed earlier, because I don't want to say there's necessarily an equivalence in terms of power. But what makes wokeness is getting rid of classical, liberal, I would say even biblical standards for judging people, judging politics, and replacing it with ID politics. Instead of Blacks, minorities, women, gays, etc., migrants, etc., we make our the so-called woke right makes its favorite categories whites and men and Christians and things like that, and judges everything on the basis of how it affects our tribe. I think that's fundamentally corrupt. And if it's happening on the right, it's just as wrong morally as it is on the left, even though the right doesn't have nearly the power that the woke left does.
Scott asked the following, Rod. Why do all of us centrists, certainly, and polls bear this out, I'll add, who constitute a majority of American citizens, seem to have so little ability to combat the extremists these days on both the left and the right?
Well, that's a great question. I think part of it is, at least judging from my position as a conservative, that we can't get any grounding within the major platforms of media with which to speak. I went on MSNBC a few years ago. I was invited on Morning Joe, and I confronted this guy Eddie Glaude, who's a Black professor at Princeton, who's very woke. And I called him out for things he said that were racist. And Joe and Mika seemed shocked by what I was saying. The fact that I was saying things that it was just common sense. And frankly, it was classically liberal. The fact that was shocking it told us something about the world that we were in. It's also the case that centrist and so-called respectable conservatives and respectable liberals have been unsuccessful in stopping left-wing wokeness. And I think that because we've been unsuccessful, the people who on the right, the extremists, say, to hell with it, we're going to go with people who will actually fight, and because victory is what matters in the end.
Do you think there's also something that feels alive in the transgression of the extreme right and the extreme left that feels authentic and like vital in a way that the center, so to speak, does not?
Yeah. And I think that's why so much of this has really been concentrated among the youth on both the left and the right. They say they don't really care anymore. And we live in a culture that has for a long time valorized emotions. We're very expressivist. Alistair McIntyre, the great moral philosopher who died a couple of weeks ago, he said back in the 1980s in his great book, After Virtue, that we have lost in the West today the sort of overarching ground of our moral debates. And therefore, we can't reason together. We can't solve any problems. All of our arguments turn on what he calls emotivism, which is to say, whoever can shout the loudest and the most effectively. And I think that probably also has a lot to do with the previous question about why we can't seem to get anywhere, because people are reasoning from such different moral bases.
Okay, here's a question that I think is extremely relevant in light of what happened 12 days ago with the murder of Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Milgram in Washington, D.C. And then, of course, what happened on a group of peaceful protesters yelling for the hostages to come home Sunday night, yesterday. I can't believe it's only yesterday in Boulder, Colorado, and it comes from
Right.
Shai. He says, over the past few years, when I've talked to left-leaning people about rising anti-Semitism, they immediately point to white nationalism and anti-Semitism on the right as the bigger threat. But I thought it was pretty marginal until now. Do you think what we're seeing represents a mainstreaming of right-wing anti-Semitism? And should I take leftists more seriously when they point it out?
Boy, that's such a good question. And I want to reiterate that there's no comparison in terms of institutional power between the woke right and the woke left. But it's the same basic immorality, the same basic trying to do all argumentation and understanding politics and culture through the lens of identity politics. It's wrong on both sides. The reason I'm speaking out now is because I want to prevent what has happened to the left, which is the Democratic Party has been overwhelmed by wokeness. You're not going to see a sister soldier moment from the Democrats because they would offend too many people in their base. I want to stop that before it gets mainstreamed on the right. But I think that a lot of leftists who point to white nationalism are arguing very much in bad faith. I mean, the New York Times, Harvard, all of these powerful left-wing institutions have totally mainstreamed wokeness. There just is nothing to compare that to on the right. But as I keep saying, that doesn't make it okay for we on the right to tolerate anti-Semitism, white nationalism, things like that on our side.
Rod, there's a very smart question from, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Mignon. Is the crushing of leftist woke ideology, fighting against it, itself a form of totalitarianism? One of my frustrations, this person says, is that the cowardice of our Congress to pass any laws to speak out against wokeness, such that we're all essentially relying on a series of executive orders to take care of the problem. But this isn't classical liberalism in my mind. Maybe another way of saying that is, what is the proper way to fight against encroaching totalitarianism, whether it comes from the left or the right?
Mm. Well, I think the most important thing we can do is pass laws. She's right. It is crazy that Congress has not found the courage to actually codify some of these executive orders. In fact, I believe one big reason that we do have Donald Trump now, why he took over the Republican Party, is the Republicans prior to Trump were terrified of speaking out against this stuff, accepting maybe campaign literature. They were terrified to do anything about it because they didn't want to be called racist, bigoted, Islamophobe, what have you, by the media. I think that we need to have solid legislation against it. And we also need to use the bully pulpit, as Trump has done effectively, to stop it. I think Chris Rufo is perhaps the best possible example of how we can fight wokeness in a deeply strategic way, not just with words, but with actions and strategies, deep strategies. But if you'll notice, Chris is not going at this as a so-called woke right person. He's going at it as somebody who believes in basic moral American decency, fair treatment, and justice for others. Chris is the model here, not Nick Fuentes.
Another question, very simple one from a woman named Esther. Rod, what on earth can the average person do here?
I say the first thing you can do is talk to your sons about this. Ask them, what are you listening to online? What are they saying? Who are they pointing you to? And have a conversation with them. So many of us normies think that this couldn't happen to our kids, but it is happening to our sons. And there are ways that you can talk to your sons. And again, this is a male thing. This isn't really a female thing. There are things that you have to talk to them about the injustice that they see in the world, that are in the way people like them are demonized by the broader culture. But you have to tell them and show them why this is wrong and what are some positive ways to fight back against it. The most important thing, though, is awareness, because we're just not seeing it. There's a reason why these professors who teach at Catholic and Protestant colleges are so shocked to see it, because like the guy I quote in the piece in the Free Press today, he teaches at an evangelical college. He said that when he's in his late 40s, he said, in my generation, support for Israel was a cultural marker for us. It's totally gone now. Now, I think there's a distinction to be made between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, but it's more and more, it's a distinction completely without a difference.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. When you mean anti-Zionism, you don't mean criticizing the government of the state of Israel.
That's right. I support the state of Israel, even in its war in Gaza. But I think that it is perfectly fair for people, and there's some on the left who do this, who criticize particular actions and policies of the state of Israel. But you're seeing more and more the criticism that some young people have of what Israel is doing in Gaza, that is bleeding over into outright anti-Semitism. And that is a big red flag.
Rod, I wonder if you could just kind of like widen the aperture a little bit as we begin to wrap up and talk a little bit about, you're a deeply religious person. And one of the things I have found is that most, not all, but most of the people that have had the courage to stand up against totalitarianism, soft totalitarianism, let's say wokeness on the left and the right, are people that are deeply religious, even quietly so. In other words, they have a countercultural value system. They have a value system that does not worship power and prestige and the fleeting things of the world. And I wonder, God and religion hasn't come up so much yet in this conversation. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about, you mentioned biblical values, but the extent to which that offers a kind of immunity to what we're seeing on the right and the left in America right now, and to what extent you tie the decline of religion to the rise of these movements.
Yeah, people are going to be religious no matter what. That's just human nature. You will worship something. You can't live in a sort of in a vacuum of morality. The decline of religion, of Christianity, of Judaism, of religion in general, since the 1990s, I think is key to this, because if you don't have a strong religious background, biblical background to tell you what is right and what is wrong, then you're going to go for something. Tribalism, ethnic tribalism, different forms of tribalism will become the substitute religion. This is what we saw with the rise of Nazism and communism in the 20th century. Those two ideologies rushed into the vacuum left by the decline of religion, of Christianity in both Russia and Germany. And it spoke to young people in those countries, and some not so young, who felt alienated from everything and everyone. They didn't trust institutions. They were looking for something to give them a sense of solidarity with other people, of community, of purpose, a reason to live. And I think that so much religion in America, and I'm speaking as a Christian about American Christianity, it has become so watered down, so therapeutic, that it doesn't give young people the answers they need in the sense of purpose that they need. It tells them basically that all you have to do is be happy and be nice to other people. That's not enough. I mean, one thing I found out from talking to the Christians who stayed behind the Iron Curtain and resisted, a lot of Christians just went along with it, just conformed to avoid trouble. But those who stood up were those who had faith so deep that it told them, I am accountable to God, and I'm willing to suffer for the sake of my convictions and suffer for the sake of truth, because in the end, God is the one I'm responsible to, not my neighbors, not the government, nobody else but God. And I think if it's not a coincidence that the civil rights movement in the U.S. was led by Black pastors. Right now, though, we have so many pastors, both on the left and the right. On the left, they endorse wokeness. And on the right, a lot of them just want to avoid trouble. I remember going to speaking once at a church I attended. Some of the people in the congregation approached me afterwards and said, this is years ago, said, what is this gender ideology thing? I don't understand it. Well, I went to the pastor and said, listen, we got a problem here, because people are wondering about it. It's just basic Christian living, discipleship. We need to talk about this. And he said, oh, no. We don't want politics in the church. I said, this isn't politics. This is just about basic morality and how do we judge this ideology that's presenting itself to our kids. And he just wouldn't have it because he wanted to avoid conflict. And I imagine there are many pastors now who can see this happening, or they hear that it's happening, this anti-Semitism, this racism that's rising among the young in their church, and they just don't want to deal with it because they don't want to cause trouble. Guess what? You better deal with it now while you still can.
Rod Dreher, I hope everyone who is unfamiliar with Rod understands why I'm proud to call him a friend. If you have not yet read his incredible book, Live Not by Lies, he has many other books, including more recent ones, but relevant to this conversation, most relevant is Live Not by Lies. Rod, tell people where they can watch the documentary version of the book.
Yeah, you can see it. It's a four-part documentary series called Live Not by Lies. You can see it streaming on angel.com, the angel.com platform. And I recommend it especially for kids, for church groups, for youth groups, because these kids might not ever pick up the book, but they can listen to the stories, the testimonies of these heroes from behind the Iron Curtain who stood up to totalitarianism, and they'll be affected by it. I mean, by the time we get to the fourth episode, I was in tears, and I know the story up and down, backwards and forwards, but just the goodness and the courage of these men and women, they have something to say to us too in our own circumstances.
Rod's essay today, of course, at the Free Press is "The Woke Right is Coming for Your Sons." It's easy to denounce our political enemies. It's much harder to do when our friends and allies embrace wicked ideas. Rod, such a pleasure to have you on here. Wish it was in person and look forward to what you write for us next.
Thanks, Barry, and thanks for giving me this space to write. This is really, really important.
Thank you. And thank you all so much for coming. For those who want to share this conversation or know people who should have been here but couldn't, this conversation should go up. If not today, then certainly by tomorrow on the Free Press's website. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. Thank you so much.